In the spring of 2015, a man named Boyd Stull drove a company pickup out to the back fence of Everett Mace's property in Claiborne County, Tennessee, stepped out onto the gravel, and stood for a long moment looking at the pale gray mound that had been accumulating there since 2009. It ran nearly 80 feet along the fence line by then, 4 feet high in places, crusted white at the top where the sun had dried the surface, and soft gray below where the fiber had compacted under its own weight. Boyd set his clipboard on the hood of the truck and made some notes. Then he looked across the fence at Everett, who had walked out from the barn with his dog Rex padding at his heels, and Boyd said, "I'll be honest with you, sir. What you got there is cellulose residue that'll break down in a few more seasons. If you're thinking about processing it into something, that's going to be a hobby, chemistry said. It's inconsistent fiber. You can't manufacture from it." 6 years later, a buyer named Hester Doan drove up from Asheville, North Carolina, held one of Everett's handmade paper lampshades against the window of his barn for about 40 seconds without saying a word, and placed an order for 1,200 shades at $148 each. She did not negotiate the price. This is the story of the 12 years between those two moments, and what Everett Mace found written in a dead man's green ledger that Boyd Stull never read. Everett was 61 when Hester arrived. He had farmed those 88 acres along the Clinch River his whole working life, first alongside his father, Glendon, and then alone after Glendon died in 1989. He was known in Claiborne County for two things: a patience that his neighbors sometimes read as stubbornness, and an eye for material that other people had given up on. His hands were permanently darkened at the knuckle lines, his hair had gone salt and pepper and stayed short, and he wore the same canvas work apron over plaid flannel from April to November, whether he was mending fence or pressing fiber on a mold. His farm ran no row crops. He kept a kitchen garden and a small timber stand he managed by selection cut, and he ran a few cattle on the bottom pasture. He did not owe the bank anything, and had not for 11 years. The pipe that changed everything was 6 inches in diameter, made of corrugated steel, and ran under the county road from the drainage field of the Callaway Fiber Products plant on the ridge above the Clinch. Callaway had operated there since 1952, making craft paper and cardboard sleeving for industrial packaging. In 2009, the plant expanded its pulp washing capacity and began routing the secondary wash effluent, a thin gray fiber slurry, through the drainage field and out that pipe at the base of Everett's back fence. It was legal. The discharge met the regional fiber content threshold for agricultural land release. The plant's compliance director, Boyd Stull, had a civil engineering degree from the University of Tennessee and 22 years in industrial waste management, and he was satisfied that the fiber content was below the threshold that would require a line collection basin. What Boyd was also satisfied about was that the fiber would decompose. He was sincere about this. He was not a bad man. He had the data from a decomposition study conducted at a similar plant in Georgia, and that study showed kraft pulp residue breaking down to background soil carbon within 3 to 5 years in well-drained river bottom conditions. Boyd had staked his professional judgment on that number, and professional judgment is hard to revise when it has been written on a form and filed. What Boyd did not have was Glendon Mace's green ledger. Glendon had worked at the Callaway plant from 1961 to 1988, first on the digester floor and then for the last 19 years as a maintenance mechanic, responsible for the wire mesh forming tables where wet fiber sheets were pressed and drained. He was a quiet man who kept a careful eye on the machines he maintained and an equally careful eye on what those machines made. Over 27 years, he filled a ledger with his observations. How fiber length changed when the wood chip mix shifted to more softwood. How the drainage rate through the forming table mesh varied by season. Why some runs produced sheets that held a crease and some produced paper that tore at the fold. He wrote in pencil in a small hand, and he drew diagrams of the forming table wire at various stages of wear, and on page 43 of that ledger, in November of 1974, he wrote a single sentence that Everett had read so many times by 2015 that he could recite it from the bottom of the stairs in the dark. Long stock is the first thing a mill wastes, and the last thing it ought to. Everett had shelved that ledger after Glendon died and not opened it for nearly 20 years. It was the pipe at his fence that brought him back to it. Let me tell you what long stock is, because Boyd Stoll's decomposition study had been right about one thing and wrong about another, and the gap between those two things is where Everett built everything. Kraft paper mills produce cellulose fiber in a range of lengths depending on the wood species, the cooking chemistry, and the washing process. Short fiber pulp, derived mainly from hardwoods like poplar and maple, breaks down fairly quickly in a wet field environment because the individual fibers are small enough that soil bacteria can colonize and digest them within a few seasons. But long fiber pulp, derived from softwoods like pine and spruce, behaves differently. The fibers are longer, sometimes 2 to 4 millimeters, and they mat together under their own weight when they dry. That mat resists bacterial breakdown because the fibers interlock into a dense layer that water and air penetrate only slowly. In the papermaking industry, fiber stock is measured partly by what millers call freeness, which is a value measured in Canadian standard freeness units that describes how quickly water drains through a fiber mat. High freeness stock drains fast because the fibers are long and don't pack tightly. Low freeness stock drains slow because the short fibers fill every gap. The Callaway plant's waste slurry came out of a secondary wash of their spruce-based liner board, and it was high freeness long stock. The Georgia decomposition study had been conducted using short fiber hardwood waste. Boyd's data was accurate. His data was simply about the wrong fiber. Glendon had written about this in the ledger, too. He had described watching mill workers shovel long stock waste into disposal trenches in the 1960s, and noting that the trenches stayed intact for years, while the field around them changed. He had described pressing a handful of damp long stock against a tobacco barn board and watching it dry into a paper-thin skin that you could not pull off with your fingers. He had, in 1981, fashioned a small flat disc of dried long stock by layering it over a tin lid and letting it cure in the sun. And he had described the disc as hard as painted pine and translucent enough to show a hand lamp through it. He had written that observation once and not returned to it. He was a maintenance mechanic, not an inventor. He simply wrote down what he saw. In 2010, the first full year of steady discharge, Everett had attended a county agricultural extension meeting at the Tazewell Community Center, where Boyd Stoll had given a brief presentation on the Callaway drainage modifications. Everett had raised his hand and asked about the fiber content in the effluent, specifically whether anyone had assessed the average fiber length at the discharge point. Boyd had looked at him the way a professional looks at a question that does not fit the form he is filling out. He said the fiber content had been assessed against the EPA threshold for agricultural release and found compliant. Everett said he understood that, but he was asking about fiber length specifically, because the material at his fence was not breaking down the way fiber typically broke down, and he wondered whether the freeness value had been measured. Boyd said he would have to consult the batch records and get back to him. he did not get back to him. A letter arrived 3 weeks later from the Callaway corporate office, confirming compliance with all applicable discharge standards and thanking Everett for raising his concern. The letter had Boyd's name in the signature block and a corporate logo at the top, and told him nothing he had not already known. Everett read that passage in the winter of 2011, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open under the hanging light, Rex asleep under the table across his boots. Outside, the fiber mound at his back fence had been there for 2 winters, and it had not decomposed. Everett had checked it every few weeks with a stick. The outer crust crumbled to dry dust. The inner mass was still fibrous, still cohesive, still pale gray and intact. He had called the county extension office once. The agent had told him it would break down and to give it time. He picked up the ledger and read the passage about the tin disc 3 more times. Then he went out to the barn and came back with a tin pie pan. He did not get it right for a long time. The first attempts, from 2011 through 2013, produced flat sheets that dried brittle and shattered when he tried to curve them. He learned quickly that the problem was the fiber-to-water ratio at the time of application. Too wet and the sheet slumped, too dry and it cracked. He learned that the stock behaved differently, depending on where along the mound he harvested it. The outer crust was over-dried and degraded. The middle layer, a foot down, was still cohesive and workable. The inner layer, against the fence posts and still damp from the latest discharge, was almost too wet to manage. The middle layer was what he wanted. He built a mold from a length of galvanized wire, formed into a drum shape, about 12 inches in diameter. He wet the middle layer fiber down to a smooth slurry in a 5-gallon bucket, pressed it over the wire mold in thin, overlapping layers, and set the whole thing in the barn out of direct sun. The first successful shade came out of the barn in the spring of 2016. It was uneven at the rim. One side was slightly thicker than the other. It had a faint green-gray tint from the cellulose chemistry. Everett held it up to a bare 60-watt bulb, and the light came through warm and diffuse, like light through old parchment. He set it on the table and looked at it for a while. Rex came in from the yard and sniffed the mold, then sat beside Everett and looked at the shade too. Everett was not a man who said much. He went back to the mound the next morning and filled 2 more buckets. By 2015, when Boyd came to the fence with his clipboard, Everett had been experimenting for 4 years. He had not told anyone except his granddaughter, Carla, who had visited the previous Easter, and looked at his workbench with the tolerant skepticism of a 26-year-old with a materials science degree. "Grandpa," she had said, standing in the barn door with her coffee, "the fiber variability alone is going to make consistent production impossible. Every batch from that mound is going to be different." She was not wrong. She was also not wrong the way Boyd Stoll was not wrong. She had the right information about what consistency looks like from the inside of a product design firm, and she was applying it to a material she had not yet watched glow. Boyd's visit in 2015 lasted about 20 minutes. He walked the fence line, made notes, consulted something on his phone, and made a few more notes. Everett walked with him and did not say much. At the end of the walk, Boyd showed him a printed page summarizing the decomposition timeline and said the fiber would be gone within 2 to 3 more seasons. Everett nodded. Then Everett asked Boyd what the freeness value was on the Callaway waste slurry. Boyd looked at him a moment. "I'd have to pull that from the batch record," he said. "It's not something we typically need for a field assessment like this." Everett said he thought the freeness was probably north of 400 Canadian standard freeness units. Boyd looked at him again, a different look this time, a brief flicker of something that was not quite recalibration. Then he wrote something on his clipboard and said, "Whatever you're planning to do with it up in the barn there, that's a hobby chemistry set. You can't manufacture from inconsistent fiber. I hope you're not spending a lot of money on this. At the Claiborne County Farm Bureau meeting in February of 2017, Boyd gave a presentation on fiber slurry management across the 3 county drainage zones affected by Callaway's discharge. He had a projector and a slide deck. The slides were thorough and the presentation was competent. And Boyd was measured and reasonable in the way that institutional professionals are when they have prepared their material and believe it fully. He addressed the question of neighbor impact directly, noting that one landowner along the Clinch Bottom had expressed interest in, as Boyd put it, processing the residue into a product, which we view as a creative approach, but not one that rises above a hobby chemistry set level, given the consistency challenges of secondary wash fiber. A few people in the room turned to look at each other. Most did not know who Boyd was referring to. Boyd moved on to the next slide. There were 22 people in that room, and the slide still glowed behind him, when the man in the second row raised his hand and asked whether Callaway had any plans to relocate the discharge point, and Boyd said there was a routing study underway, and that was the last substantive question of the evening. Everett was not there. He had been invited and had not come, because he had a batch of shades in the drying phase, and he did not like to leave them unattended in a cold barn in February. He had 14 shades on the racks by then, and he had been working for nearly 6 years on the problem of rim finish, the edge where the fiber sheet met the wire armature, and had to be folded and pressed without cracking. He had tried dampening the fold before pressing. He had tried leaving the rim dry. The best results, he had found, came from pre-wetting the armature wire itself with diluted flaxseed oil the morning before he applied the fiber, so the fiber bonded to the wire rather than drying separately and pulling away. He had reached this understanding through 4 years of trial and 63 shades that had either cracked, slumped, or simply fallen off the wire, and it was not the kind of understanding that could have been written down before the trying, because no one had tried this particular fiber on this particular form before. Dale Pruitt was one of the 22 at the Farm Bureau meeting. He told Everett about it the following weekend over the fence that ran between their properties. Dale was a good neighbor in the way that the best rural neighbors are. Frank, careful, genuinely interested in your welfare, and honest enough to repeat an uncomfortable thing without prettying it up. He had his own concerns about the drainage, and he had been one of 3 landowners who had asked the county about odor abatement the previous summer. He was 2 years into his combine note by then, and the soybean market was running right. And he was the picture of a successful conventional operation, a clean equipment shed, a straight road field, a truck he had traded every 4 years for the last 20. They called it a hobby, Dale said. I didn't know what to say. I thought about defending you, but I didn't know enough about what you were doing to stand up in the room. Everett said that was all right. Dale said, Are you going to sell any of them? Everett said he thought so. Dale nodded and looked out at his field and said, Well, I hope it works out. If you have been around a person who keeps their own counsel for long enough, you know the difference between stubbornness and confidence. Stubbornness is brittle. Confidence is quiet. Everett was quiet. The question of selling came up more urgently in the spring of 2018 when Carla came home. Her product design firm in Knoxville had restructured and eliminated her position, and she came back to the farm with 2 boxes of drafting supplies and the resolute expression of a person who has decided not to seem defeated. She was 29. She had been sending job applications for 6 weeks and getting no responses. She came into the barn the first afternoon and stood at Everett's workbench for a long time, looking at the shades. There were 43 of them by then, hung on wire hooks from a rafter, each one slightly different in tint and wall thickness, but all of them sharing a certain quality of light, a warmth that you could not quite name, but that made you want to stand under one. She picked one up and held it to the single bare bulb in the barn ceiling. She stood like that for what might have been a full minute. She was doing something professional in her head, Everett could tell, assessing wall thickness, looking for voids in the fiber lay, checking whether the rim had held the wire or pulled away from it. She had spent 3 years doing precisely this work for other people's products in an office in Knoxville, and she was doing it now in her grandfather's barn in November with her coffee going cold in her other hand. She set the shade down and said, "What binder are you using?" Everett said flaxseed oil, worked in at the layering stage, thin enough that it didn't color the fiber. She picked up another one and turned it in her hands, pressing the wall gently between 2 fingers. "What's your freeness on the stock you're harvesting?" Everett told her he did not have a proper meter for it, but he was working by feel. If the stock hung off his hand and dripped in a slow, continuous thread, it was right. If it splattered, too wet. If it clumped and pulled, too dry. Carla put the shade down and looked at the others on the hooks. There were 43 of them, each one slightly different in tint and wall thickness, and none of them exactly alike, hung in the amber barn light like 43 versions of the same quiet idea. "Grandpa," she said, "these are actually really good." He found Glendon's ledger that evening and put it on the table in front of her. She read it under the hanging kitchen light for 2 hours, while Everett washed the supper dishes and Rex settled under the table. When she was done, she looked up and said, "He figured this out in 1981. Everett said he had just never done anything with it. In October of 2019, Boyd Stull came back to the fence. The EPA Region 4 office had conducted an audit of fiber discharge operations across several East Tennessee drainage zones, and Callaway Fiber had been assessed an $84,000 fine for excess fiber content in its discharge stream, measured at a monitoring point downstream of Everett's property. The fine was not related to Everett's fence line directly, but Boyd had been reassigned to oversee a remediation protocol that included formal documentation of all downstream fiber accumulation sites. He came with a new form, a different clipboard, and the same pressed khakis. He walked the fence line again, noted that the mound had diminished in height since his last visit, made his notes. Everett walked with him again. At the end, Boyd wrote something and said, "I see you've been removing material from the accumulation. For the record, are you still working on the hobby chemistry set?" He said it without emphasis. As a category, he had filed this under years before, and saw no reason to refile. "Still working," Everett said. Carla had heard this from the barn door. She told Everett that evening that they needed to get the product in front of buyers. Everett said he thought so too. By the end of 2019, they had 340 shades in inventory, stored on the rafter hooks, and on a second rack Carla had built from scrap lumber. Carla had transcribed Glendon's relevant ledger pages into a typed process document she called the Mace Fiber Notes, a 23-page record of stock selection, freeness assessment by hand, layer count, binder ratios, drying time by season, and rim finishing. She had standardized Everett's wire molds to 5 sizes, from a 9-inch diameter bedside shade to an 18-inch drum. The shades were not uniform. They were never going to be uniform. That was the point. Here is something worth knowing about handmade paper goods in the lighting market. By 2019, the category had been dominated for 2 decades by machine-produced composite shades manufactured at scale in Southeast Asia and sold through catalog distributors at margins thin enough that any disruption in freight cost could tip a supplier into loss. The handmade end of the market, served mainly by artisan producers in Portugal, Morocco, and parts of Japan, commanded wholesale prices between $90 and $200 per piece, depending on size and finish quality. The buyers who sought those producers were interior designers, boutique hospitality companies, and specialty lighting distributors who needed product that had a visible human hand in it. The machine-made product could not fake this. You could see the difference when you held a shade to a window. The light came through flat. Everett's shades did not come through flat. In March of 2020, Carla drove 12 shades to a craft market in Knoxville and put them on a folding table with a $50 table fee and a handwritten card that said, "Clinch River Paper Shades, Claiborne County, Tennessee." She sold 10 of them in 4 hours at $85 each. A woman who bought 2 of them asked if she had a wholesale catalog. Carla came home that evening and stood in the barn door and said, "We need more molds." The summer of 2020 was the year Carla's conversion completed itself. If a conversion that had been underway for 2 years since she first held a shade to a barn bulb can be said to complete in a single season. She called her former firm in Knoxville in June and declined a callback offer. She told Everett that evening at the kitchen table. He nodded and passed her the salt. Rex was on the floor between their chairs. There was not much else said, because there did not need to be. They went into 2021 with over 800 shades in inventory and 4 dozen molds in 3 sizes. Carla had been sending the Knoxville craft market photos and a short written description of the process to a list of about 30 buyers she had compiled from lighting industry directories and interior design associations. She received 8 inquiry responses. 6 of those petered out after the sample stage. 1 converted to a small retail order of 40 shades. And then one afternoon in May of 2021, a woman drove up the gravel road in a gray cargo van with North Carolina plates and parked in front of the barn. Hester Doan was 47 and had been buying handmade paper goods for boutique lighting distributors for 19 years. She had found Everett's shades through the same Knoxville craft market contact who had sent her the inquiry 18 months earlier. She had waited, she said later, because she wanted to see whether the product was a one-season novelty or whether the maker was still producing. She came into the barn and looked at the rafter racks for a long time without speaking. She picked up a 12-inch drum shade, turned it twice in her hands, and walked to the barn door with it and held it against the open sky. The May morning light came through the shade the color of old honey. She held it there for roughly 40 seconds. Then she set it down on the workbench and said, "Are all of them this consistent in fiber lay?" Carla said no, not all of them. She showed Hester the grade range they had established, the tightest fiber lay, and most even wall thickness in one rack, the wider variation in another, and the deliberately irregular showpieces in a third. Hester looked at each rack without hurrying. She moved slowly, picking up a shade from each tier, holding it briefly, setting it down. She did not speak for 4 or 5 minutes. Carla stood near the workbench and did not fill the silence. Everett stood near the door and did not fill it either. Rex was asleep in the yard. Hester picked up one from the irregular rack, held it to the barn door light the same way she had held the first one, and this time she turned it slowly so the illumination traveled across the surface. Where the fiber had laid thin, the light came through bright. Where it had laid thick, the light went warm and amber. Both qualities moved across the same shade, the way light moves across old window glass, and neither quality was wrong. "What do you call this quality tier?" she said. Carla said they had not named it yet. Hester said, "You should." She set it down and consulted her tablet. Then she asked what their wholesale price was on the mid-grade line, which was the 12-inch drum in the standard rack. Carla said $148. Hester looked at her tablet and made a note. She did not count her. She asked how many units they could commit to on a purchase order basis over the following 6 months. Carla looked at Everett. Everett was standing near the door with his hands in the pockets of his canvas apron, watching Hester the way he watched anything new come onto his property. Quietly, without expression, taking in what it was, he said, "1,200, Hester said. "I'll take them." She said it the way a person says a number they settled on 20 minutes ago. Flat. Without ceremony. The way a thing that has been true in a person's mind for a while is finally said where someone else can hear it. The number was $177,600. It did not come out all at once in a room. It came out in a brief, quiet moment after Hester had walked back to her van to write the purchase order details on her tablet, and Carla had turned to Everett and said, "What is 12 times 148?" And Everett had worked it in his head and said 177.6. And Carla had been still for a moment the way a person goes still when an abstraction resolves itself into arithmetic. She looked at the barn ceiling, which held 3 racks of shades and the shelf above the workbench with the green ledger on it. "That's one purchase order," she said. Everett said, "Yes." Rex padded in from the yard, having heard something in the tone of the barn that he could not name but wanted to be near, and sat between them and looked at the shade racks. Nobody said anything for a while. The shade Hester had held to the light was still there on the workbench, and the May morning was still coming through it, and the light it cast on the barn floor was warm and slightly amber, and fell quietly on the old boards in a way that no company, slide deck, and no compliance form, and no Georgia decomposition study had anticipated or accounted for. Boyd Stull called the farm in June of 2021. He was calling to notify them, per the remediation protocol, that Callaway's drainage modifications would effectively end new fiber discharge at the fence line by the following spring, and the existing accumulation would be formally documented and closed out. In the course of the call, he asked how the production operation was going. Everett told him. Boyd was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was wrong about the fiber consistency. I didn't have the right data." Another pause. "Would it be all right if I came out and had a look at the process? I'd like to understand what you worked out about the freeness assessment." Everett said he could come any Saturday morning. Boyd came on a Saturday in July. He spent most of the morning at Everett's workbench, watching the layering process and asking careful questions. Carla showed him the Mace fiber notes and the pages of Glendon's ledger that had pointed them to the freeness question in the first place. Boyd read slowly. He read the 1974 passage about long stock twice. He looked up and said, "Your father understood this better than the decomposition literature did." Everett said his father had watched the forming tables for 19 years and written down everything he saw. Boyd nodded. He held a damp fiber layer over a wire mold and pressed it with his palms the way Carla had showed him. He was not good at it yet. He asked if he could come back. Everett said yes. In the months after the Hester Doan order, 6 other families along the Clinch River bottom asked Everett and Carla to teach them the process. 3 of them had fiber accumulation at their own fence lines from the same Callaway drainage field. 2 had no accumulation, but sources of cellulose waste from a nearby sawmill, shavings and bark peelings that Carla tested against the freeness standard in Glendon's notes and found workable with a modified layering schedule. One family had a small paper sheet operation already and wanted to convert to lampshade molds. Carla taught the sessions in Everett's barn on Saturday mornings through the fall of 2021 and into 2022. She had printed copies of the Mace fiber notes with Glendon's original ledger diagrams reproduced at the front of each copy. The diagrams were pencil sketches of forming table cross-sections and fiber mat structures, drawn by a maintenance mechanic in the 1970s, and they were more useful than anything in the current published literature on handmade paper goods because they described the specific fiber Glendon had worked with for 27 years, which was the same fiber now coming out of the ground at 6 neighboring fence lines. Everett usually came in around mid-morning, poured coffee from the thermos on the workbench, and stood near the door watching people hold fiber over wire molds for the first time. He did not lecture. If someone's layer was too thin, he sometimes walked over and pressed it with 2 fingers and said, "A little more here." That was generally enough. Dale Pruitt did not join the lampshade sessions. By the fall of 2021, the drought that had run through the Clinch River Basin from late June through September had reduced his soybean yield to 38% below the county average, and the commodity price drop that had come in behind the drought had made the shortfall into something harder. Dale had sold 62 of his 110 acres that October to cover what remained on the combine note. He was a good man, and Everett said nothing to him about it except that there was work on the farm if he needed it. And Dale said he appreciated that. And they stood at the fence between their properties, the way they had stood there for 20 years. 2 men who had farmed side by side and respected each other's choices. The drought had not touched Everett's operation because Everett had no crop. He had cattle on the bottom pasture that moved up to the timber stand during the dry weeks, and a kitchen garden that he watered from the hand pump at the well, and a barn full of fiber that Calloway had piped to his fence, regardless of rainfall since 2009. His material cost was 0. His equipment cost, over 12 years, had been the price of wire for the molds, the flaxseed oil, and 2 5-gallon buckets that had been replaced once each. The drought was the kind of event that separated 2 kinds of operation: the kind that required the rain to come on schedule and the commodity market to hold, and the kind that had built itself around what was already there, regardless of what the season brought. Dale's situation was not a failure of character or intelligence. He had done what the County Extension Service had advised, what the equipment dealer had made easy, what the Farm Bureau meeting presentations had described as a sound and viable path. He had borrowed at 5.9% over 7 years to buy the machine that made the system run efficiently, and the system had run efficiently right up to the summer that the rain did not come, and the price dropped simultaneously, which is the nature of agricultural risk. It does not announce itself, and it does not arrive singly. 62 acres went to the buyer in October. Dale kept 48 acres and a paid-off mule shed and his good name in the community, and he was still farming, reduced and careful now in the way that a man learns to be careful when the big bet has already been called. Everett watched Dale's fields go dry that summer from across their shared fence. He said nothing about what was happening except once, in August, when he brought Dale a flat of tomatoes from the kitchen garden and set them on the porch rail without knocking. Dale found them that evening and called to say thank you. Everett said he had more tomatoes than he could eat. That was all either of them said about the summer of 2021. Everett paid off the small remaining lien on his 1964 Farmall tractor in November of 2021. It came to $3,200. He wrote the check and drove the Farmall out of the shed and idled it in the yard for a while with no particular purpose. Rex lay in the doorway of the shed and watched him. The afternoon light was coming in low and amber across the river bottom. Everett sat on the tractor and listened to the engine, and then shut it off and climbed down. There is a thing that happens when a system has been patient, long enough that the world finally stops moving faster than it can run and the two come level. It does not look like victory from the outside. It looks like a man on a paid-off tractor in a field in November. The Mace Fiber Notes, the document Carla had built from Glendon's ledger, was registered as a teaching document with the Claiborne County Farm Bureau in 2022 at the suggestion of the Bureau's outreach coordinator, who had watched the Saturday sessions and thought the process had reached beyond the Clinch River bottom. By the following spring, copies had gone out to 4 other counties in the valley. Carla was in conversation with the Appalachian Regional Commission about a fiber arts extension grant that would allow the Saturday sessions to run across 2 additional river bottom communities where mill drainage had created similar accumulations. Glendon Mace's green ledger lived in the barn on a shelf above the workbench. It had been there since Carla put it there the first time she read it, because that was where it belonged, within reach of the molds and the wire and the 5-gallon buckets where the work happened. She had put a piece of tape on the shelf edge with the year written on it in marker, 1961. Not to mark when the ledger had started, but to mark how long this particular knowledge had been patient, waiting for somebody to need it. On a Thursday evening in late October of 2023, Everett sat on the porch after supper with the light going gold and then purple over the ridge. Rex lay at his feet, the hound's muzzle fully gray now, his broad chest rising and falling slow. The mound at the back fence was gone, leveled by 2 seasons of harvesting and by the Callaway drainage closure that Boyd's remediation protocol had finalized that spring. The fence posts stood in clean grass. The barn behind Everett held 400 shades in inventory, staged and tagged for the winter order that Hester's distributor had expanded from the summer's successful placement. The ledger was inside on the shelf. There are 2 ways of knowing a piece of ground. One way is to fly over it with good instruments and write down what the instruments read. The other way is to stand on it in the same boots for 40 years and write down what you see. The first kind of knowing is fast and confident and almost always right about what it measures. The second kind is slow and local and almost always right about what cannot be measured, which turns out to be the thing that matters when the rains fail or the market turns or a pipe starts running fiber at a fence line and everyone with a clipboard tells you it will be gone in 3 seasons. Callaway Fiber Products did not intend to give Everett Mace anything. They were managing a drainage problem with the tools and data they had. Boyd Stull was not trying to cheat anyone. He was a careful professional, doing what careful professionals do, which is to apply the available model to the available facts and write the result on a form. The model was wrong about the fiber. The form had been wrong for 12 years before anyone looked up from it. What Glendon Mace knew in 1974, he had written down in pencil in a green ledger on a shelf in a barn in Claiborne County, Tennessee, and the sentence was still there when his son needed it. Long stock is the first thing a mill wastes and the last thing it ought to.